The Battle of Omdurman, fought on September 2, 1898, was one of the most decisive and symbolic battles of the late 19th century, marking the climax of the Anglo-Egyptian reconquest of Sudan. This clash was more than a military confrontation. It was a collision between two worlds, one representing industrial age imperial power, and the other representing a deeply rooted religious and cultural movement fighting to preserve its independence. The battle took place just outside the city of Omdurman, located across the Nile from Khartoum, and it resulted in a dramatic demonstration of how technology and tactics had shifted the balance of global power in favor of European empires. To understand the significance of Omdurman, one must first look back at the events that led to it. Sudan in the late 19th century was under the rule of the Mahdist state, founded by Muhammad Ahmed, a charismatic religious leader who proclaimed himself the Mahdi, the expected one in Islamic tradition. In 1885, his followers overran Khartoum, defeating the Egyptian garrison led by British General Charles Gordon. This victory shocked Britain in Egypt and led to the establishment of a theocratic Mahdist regime that governed Sudan for over a decade. By the mid-1990s, Britain, which effectively controlled Egypt following its occupation in 1882, was determined to reassert control over Sudan. The motivations were both strategic and political. Sudan's location along the Nile made it crucial to safeguarding British interests in Egypt, particularly the Suez Canal, the lifeline to India. Moreover, French colonial ambitions in Central Africa were pressing toward the Nile Valley, and British policymakers feared that leaving Sudan in Mahdist hands could allow rival European powers to gain a foothold. The man tasked with leading the reconquest was Major General Herbert Kitchener, a disciplined and meticulous officer who believed in careful preparation and overwhelming force. Beginning in 1896, Kitchener led a methodical campaign up the Nile, constructing railways to supply his troops, using gunboats to dominate the river, and employing a modern Anglo-Egyptian army composed of British regulars and well-trained Egyptian and Sudanese soldiers. This force was equipped with the latest military technology, including Maxim machine guns and quick-firing artillery, weapons that would prove decisive at Omdurman. By late August 1898, Kitchener's army had advanced to within striking distance of Omdurman, where the successor of the Mahdi, the Khalifa Abdallah, had gathered a massive force of warriors determined to repel the invaders. It was here, on the open plains north of Omdurman, that one of the most lopsided yet historically important battles of the 19th century would unfold. By the eve of the battle, Kitchener had assembled an impressive Anglo-Egyptian force numbering around 25,000 men. This army was a model of late Victorian military organization. It included about 8,000 British regular soldiers, such as infantry regiments, such as the Cameron Highlanders, Grenadier Guards, and the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, as well as cavalry units like the 21st Lancers. Supporting them were some 17,000 well-trained Egyptian and Sudanese troops, commanded by British officers, but hardened by previous campaigns. Most crucially, Kitchener's army was equipped with the latest military technology, including Maxim machine guns and quick-firing artillery, weapons that would prove decisive at Omdurman.
On the morning of September 2nd, 1898, as dawn broke over the desert, the Mahdist forces began to assemble for battle. Their massive army spread out in a crescent formation, drums beating and banners flying, a scene that British observers later described as both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The Khalifa hoped to use sheer weight of numbers to overwhelm Kitchener's army in a single decisive charge, the same tactic that had crushed Egyptian forces years earlier. But this time, the defenders were prepared, and the technology of war had changed. As the Mahdist columns advanced, the Anglo-Egyptian artillery opened fire, sending explosive shells tearing through the densely packed formations. Within moments, the Maxim guns joined in, unleashing streams of bullets that mowed down attackers in terrifying swaths. The air filled with smoke, dust, and the roar of gunfire, as the first phase of the Battle of Omdurman erupted in a storm of modern firepower. The first wave of the Mahdist assault came in shortly after sunrise. Tens of thousands of warriors surged forward, chanting religious slogans and waving their banners. From a distance, they looked like a rolling sea of humanity, their white jibbas, the patched tunics of the Ansar, glowing against the desert backdrop. British and Egyptian soldiers, standing behind their earthworks, braced themselves for the oncoming storm. Kitchener's artillery opened up with devastating precision, targeting the densest clusters of attackers. Shells exploded in the midst of the Mahdist ranks, tearing great gaps in their lines, yet the warriors pressed on, undeterred by the carnage. Then, the Maxim guns began their deadly work. Mounted on tripods and manned by trained crews, these early machine guns could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. Waves of Ansar were cut down before they could get within rifle range, their attacks disintegrating into chaos under the sheer volume of fire. For over 2 hours, the battle raged as one wave after another hurled itself against the Anglo-Egyptian line. The defenders fired steadily and coolly, disciplined volleys from British Lee Medford rifles alternating with the chatter of Maxims and the thunder of artillery. The Nile gunboats also joined in, bombarding Mahdist positions from the riverbank. It was a symphony of industrial warfare, in stark contrast to the brave but outdated mass charges of the Mahdist army. Despite the horrific losses, there were moments of extraordinary bravery. Some Mahdist warriors managed to close within a few hundred yards of the trenches, engaging in brief firefights before being annihilated by withering crossfire. Others attempted flanking maneuvers, trying to find weak points in Kitchener's position, but the disciplined Anglo-Egyptian formations held firm. By late morning, the battlefield was strewn with the dead and dying. Contemporary accounts estimated that thousands of Mahdist fighters had already been killed in this first phase of the battle, while Kitchener's forces had suffered only minimal casualties. Yet, the Khalifa was not ready to concede defeat. He still had reserves waiting, and he was determined to launch a second massive assault in the hope of breaking through before nightfall. Kitchener, for his part, was cautious. He kept his army largely in place, resisting the temptation to counterattack too soon. He knew that the Mahdists were not yet finished, and that committing his troops prematurely could open them up to a counterstroke. Instead, he ordered his men to maintain their positions and prepare for what everyone knew was coming next, another, even larger wave of attacks. As the morning wore on, the Khalifa rallied his remaining forces and prepared for a second assault. This wave was even larger than the first, as thousands of fresh warriors who had been held in reserve now surged forward. From Kitchener's vantage point, the desert seemed to come alive, as the Mahdist crescent stretched across the horizon, determined to crush the Anglo-Egyptian army in one last effort. Once again, Kitchener's artillery and Maxims roared to life. Shells burst among the attackers, tearing apart entire groups at a time. But unlike the earlier waves, this assault included more riflemen who fired back as they advanced, forcing the defenders to keep low. The battlefield became a deafening hellscape of smoke, dust, and screams as modern weapons met fanatical courage. One of the most dramatic episodes of the battle occurred during this phase, the famous charge of the 21st Lancers. Tasked with clearing a group of Mahdist riflemen believed to be a small force, the cavalry regiment advanced across the plain. To their shock, they discovered that they had ridden straight into a hidden force of several thousand Ansar concealed in a depression. What followed was one of the last great cavalry charges in British history. The Lancers, armed with sabers and lances, charged through the Mahdist position in a wild melee. Horses collided, swords flashed, and the fighting was hand-to-hand at brutal close quarters. Despite being outnumbered, the discipline and momentum of the cavalry charge carried the day. The Lancers hacked and slashed their way through, regrouped, and charged again, inflicting heavy casualties before withdrawing to the main line. Among those present was a young Winston Churchill, then a junior officer and war correspondent, who would later write vividly about the experience.
Back on the main front, the second wave of Mahdist attacks met the same fate as the first. The defenders' superior firepower was simply too much to overcome. By early afternoon, the Mahdist army was shattered, its formations breaking apart under relentless gunfire. Those who could fled toward Omdurman, leaving the plain littered with the dead. Kitchener, now confident that the Khalifa's ability to launch a coordinated attack had been broken, prepared to advance. His objective was not merely to repel the Mahdists, but to destroy their ability to resist British rule altogether. The order was given for a general advance toward Omdurman, setting the stage for the final act of the battle. With the Mahdist army reeling, Kitchener seized the opportunity to move his forces forward. The Anglo-Egyptian infantry advanced in disciplined formation, keeping their lines tight as they swept across the battlefield. The Egyptian and Sudanese brigades moved in tandem with the British units, supported by cavalry on the flanks and gunboats on the Nile, which continued to shell Mahdist positions near the riverbank. As they approached Omdurman, they encountered pockets of desperate resistance. Small groups of Ansar, refusing to flee, launched last-ditch attacks, forcing Kitchener's men to engage in close-range firefights. These skirmishes were fierce but brief. The disciplined volleys of the British infantry and the steady advance of Egyptian troops quickly overpowered any remaining opposition. The Mahdist warriors fought with extraordinary bravery, but they could not withstand the devastating combination of rifles, machine guns, and artillery that backed Kitchener's advance. By mid-afternoon, the Khalifa realized that his army was destroyed. The plain outside Omdurman was a scene of terrible carnage. An estimated 10,000 Mahdist fighters lay dead, with thousands more wounded. By contrast, Kitchener's army suffered fewer than 500 casualties, a testament to the extraordinary effectiveness of modern weapons and tactics. Yet the campaign was not over. The Khalifa himself had escaped the battlefield, retreating into the desert with a corps of loyal followers. Kitchener would need to hunt him down in the months to come to ensure that Mahdist resistance was fully broken. For now, however, Omdurman was secure, and the reconquest of Sudan was effectively complete. The Battle of Omdurman was more than just a military victory. It was a turning point in the history of Sudan and a defining moment of British imperial power at the close of the 19th century. The battle showcased, perhaps more clearly than any other conflict of the era, the devastating effect of industrial-age technology on traditional armies. Maxim guns, quick-firing artillery, and disciplined rifle volleys could annihilate a numerically superior force in open battle. In many ways, Omdurman foreshadowed the killing power that would dominate the battlefields of World War I less than 2 decades later. For Britain, the victory secured its control over the entire Nile Valley, from Egypt to Khartoum, and effectively ended the Mahdist state. The reconquest was celebrated back home as a triumph of civilization over what many Victorians saw as fanaticism. Major General Herbert Kitchener was hailed as a national hero, promoted to Lord Kitchener of Khartoum, and would later rise to even greater fame during World War I. The campaign also strengthened Britain's geopolitical position, preempting French ambitions in the region and consolidating the Anglo-Egyptian condominium that would govern Sudan until the mid-20th century. But the legacy of Omdurman was not entirely of celebration. Even at the time, some critics questioned the morality of the battle, describing it as a massacre rather than a fair fight. The disparity in casualties, with over 12,000 Mahdists killed compared to fewer than 50 British soldiers, was stark. Many argued that the annihilation of the Mahdist army went beyond military necessity, reflecting the harsh logic of empire and the desire to make an example of those who resisted British authority. In Sudan, the memory of the battle is more complex. For many, Omdurman became a symbol of both tragic loss and enduring resistance. The Mahdist warriors, though defeated,
were remembered for their courage and their determination to defend their land and faith. The Khalifa's eventual death in 1899 marked the final chapter of Mahdist rule, but the ideals of independence and defiance against foreign domination would resurface decades later during Sudan's nationalist movements. Today, the Battle of Omdurman stands as one of the last great set-piece battles of the 19th century, a clash where courage met modernity and where the outcome shaped the political destiny of an entire region. It was a victory that confirmed Britain's global power, but also a sobering reminder of the human cost of imperial conquest. For historians, Omdurman remains a case study in the transformation of warfare and a powerful example of how technology can alter the balance of history in a single day.